Okay, so the title of my talk is Peekaboo, the Data Can See You, Identifying Vulnerable Populations Hidden in Plain Sight. So I want to start with the elephant in the room, and that is data. I want to acknowledge that often large data sets are not always inclusive. Oversampling of some marginalized populations doesn't exist. And for those who do work with the Asian American, Pacific Islander community, fully aware of this, as well as if you do work on Indigenous Americans or the LGBTQ community. And large data sets don't always ask the questions that reflect the experiences of marginalized populations. And an example of this, I think more recently, is collecting data on the experiences of the LGBTQ community. So if you look at the census just looks at same-sex marriages. So it's difficult to get a feel, one, about gender identity, and then what are the compositions in the household. And one of the questions that I've noticed that the census has stopped collecting information on is children ever born. And so for anyone who's looking to do research on mothers, and not necessarily defined by whether or not there's a child in your household, but mothers more broadly, since 1990, you really can't use the census to do that because a mother is defined by someone who has a child in her home. And as someone who just turned double nickels, whose mother is very near, I can tell you, she still treats me like a child, right? So I know that mothering does not stop just because your kid is not in your home. But having said that, I also want to remind folks that despite some of the gaps in the data for the large public surveys like the census, current population survey, or American Community Survey, or even some of the health data sets, that your interviews, that the relationships that you have with your constituents, those narratives that you collect, that words are data. I often have to remind folks that data isn't just limited to, numbers. And as I was thinking about this today, I wanted to make the point that when we're completing surveys, we actually respond to words that then folks like me who do data analysis may change to numerical values, and then we come back to those words to then talk about what the results are. So there's a plethora of software programs that are out that will help you analyze the words and the narratives that you're collecting. And I mean this in ways that are sort of beyond the word clouds, where we, see what are the responses that are most frequent, but to actually get into some of the nitty-gritty about some of the questions that you're interested in, that these data sets don't address. Now, having said that, there's a term that says vulnerable, and I want to start with what we mean by a vulnerable population. So at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, we have been toying with the vulnerable populations framework. We've been borrowing from the literature on disaster and health to get an idea of what it means to be vulnerable. And so when we say vulnerability, we are talking about the characteristics of a person or a group that influence their capability to anticipate a risk, to then cope with that risk, resist that risk or protect, and then to recover from that risk. All of those are the ways that we think about vulnerability. So having said that, my schoolmate, Benga Ajalori, tweeted this almost a year ago. So, this would have been very much as we were thinking about the pandemic and how we were going to recover. And he tweeted, "Who you center says a lot about who you value." And notice he pinned that tweet because he was like, that was a great tweet. And I am sure that for many of us, that very much resonates, right? Like who you value, you put at the center to then make decisions about. But with our vulnerability framework, what we're asking people is to shift from the who at the center to the vulnerability at the center. And you might be asking, what's the difference? The difference is this. Who is a characteristic? Like single earner household, low-wage worker, and I have to admit my favorite is the bottom, that essential worker. And I'm going to take a moment and digress here because Allison and I were talking earlier about Nicole Martin-Rogers, who is going to be participating in a webinar that the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race is going to do around disaggregating data. And essential workers is a prime example of this. I often ask people, so when we think about essential workers, we've got essential workers who are frontline, and we have essential workers who are remote. And then when we think about essential workers who are frontline, we have the essential workers who are what we think about as the more high skills. So your doctors, your nurses. And then we have our cashiers and our folks who we think about as lower skilled and more in the low wage. Those workers I have been known to refer to as expendable because they were last to get the personal protection equipment. And even if we're thinking about vaccines, the group that was pushed front and center for the vaccine were your doctors and lawyers. So I often think about the ways in which we need to disaggregate data because it actually hides a lot of the nuances, as you heard in my introduction. So having said that, who is a characteristic? And here's an example that we will come back to. And the who has a commonality, and that is economic insecurity, right? The commonality in those groups, thank you, Jeannie. The commonality in those groups is economic insecurity. So what we suggest is in focusing on that vulnerability or whatever vulnerability that you're concerned about. And then that leads us to something that looks like this. So as we're thinking about vulnerability at the center, we first think about the consequences. Are they long-term or are they short-term? And short-term and long-term, we all know is relative. I would argue that a long-term consequence is one that is going to be years, potentially generations. And then we want to think about characteristic of the place, i.e. what are the resources available in the community that will allow people to protect, recover, anticipate. And then we want to think about the individuals. And when we think about individuals, that's generally when we think about demographic data. We think about things like race and gender, education, one that I've been advocating for people to think about family structure, i.e. not just marital status, but marital status and the presence of children, both in the home or period, whether or not you have kids. And as I'm sitting here thinking about this, probably I should expand to thinking about family structure to be more broad, to be about household structure, who are the dependents in your home that you have a responsibility for. And also being mindful that place and individual are not mutually exclusive, right? That they have an interconnectedness as well as the consequence, thinking about whether it's long-term or short-term. And then what we want to think about is if we take the characteristics of both the community and the individual, and we think about long and short-term consequences, and we look at the interplay of those, which some people will think about as the intersection, thinking about intersectionality of how characteristics and consequences make people more or less vulnerable. We ask that in the process of doing that intersection and thinking about your groups, that we are mindful not to aggregate, because that will hide, but to disaggregate your data, not just by race and gender or by the intersection of race and gender, but by the characteristics that you have identified that influence the vulnerability, right? Because it is that vulnerability, that outcome that we are most concerned about. And then once we've done that, we're going to look for some commonalities, and those commonalities help us identify our vulnerable populations. So you might be asking, and I'm going to get to this, is how does the data play a part in this? So if I take us back, and instead of centering on any one of the groups, I center on economic insecurity. I think about the consequence, the characteristics, the interplay, and then I disaggregate. I might still get the same group: single earner households, low-wage workers, and essential workers, right? Still might get those very same groups. But here is where we're going to pivot just a little bit. I am going to take a look at the single earner households and begin to disaggregate. And when I often think about single earner households, here are the folks that I think about. Mainly, I think broadly, two types of households. I think about earners with dependents, and I think about myself, single people, right? Those are our single earner households. I have been told that the single people, people like me, folks don't think about us as being vulnerable. And I'm thinking, but if you are keeping in the back of your mind economic insecurity as the vulnerability, how could you not think about single people? But if you look at our policies don't necessarily think about single people. And I wonder if it is because, as my Uncle Jack will ask me every now and then, he says, when you eat, your whole family eats, right? Yep. Where you go, your whole family goes, right? Yep. I.e., it's just this one body, right? And that one person, that single household, most people are not thinking about. And I often advocate for the single person to be considered a family, and that family isn't defined by having other dependents who may or may not be related to you, or children. And then we have earners with dependents, and this looks a variety of ways. It may be the household, the single parent, and so generally when I ask about single earner households, this is the response that I get. Most people will say to me, a single parent. Sometimes I will get an earner with an adult dependent. Now, I don't know how many folks out there have had their children return because of the pandemic, or who had their children come home from the Great Recession and never leave. But that would be an example. But this also may be a household that's taking care of an aging loved one. Then there's an earner with an adult dependent and kids. And this is the household that I think is hiding in plain sight. And here is why. The commonality for all of these groups is that there is one, well, actually, I'm going to pause here because this group is small enough. So let me ask the group, because this is intimate enough for me to do this. Can someone tell me what's the common thread between these households that are on the screen? Don't be shy. Anyone? No? Okay. Go ahead, Jeannie, you unmuted.
Well, is it just because there's only the one earner? But you said that, so.
Yeah.
What you're looking for.
It is the one earner. It is the one wage that makes everybody on this screen vulnerable. But the earner with the adult and the dependent, we don't think about as vulnerable. Someone said to me, for this household, this is a privileged household. We think of this as a household where someone can afford to stay at home, right? And so we don't think about them as being vulnerable. But here is the key. If the wage earner loses their job, the adult who has been staying at home, it is not likely that they can enter the labor force and replace that income. We know that when the wage earner loses their earnings, it puts everyone in the house more at risk for violence. We've also seen from the Great Recession that when wage earners lose their jobs, there's a higher rate of suicide. Now, this was not a group that we think about. But as I was thinking about the framework and thinking about a good deal of a conversation about low-wage workers and thinking about who that group was and why we're generally concerned about them, and even in that group, you have, the working poor, and we have, single moms who we think about in that group. And as I was looking at the data, I was like, oh, wow. There is also this household. So when we center on vulnerability, it reframes our conversation. As I was we've gotten some funding from the Tara Health Foundation to actually do this framework. And as I was talking to our program officer, one of the things that I've said to her around vulnerability that was really, really clear to me during the pandemic is decisions were made around vulnerability. When we realized that older Americans were highly susceptible to the coronavirus, we protected them. When we began to think about the vulnerability of the economy, we got the CARES Act. I would love for someone to be able to tell me how many days it took for the CARES Act, because I am sure it set a record that was, bipartisan, clearly for America, i.e. to make sure that we weren't going to go into a recession that would be more devastating than what we saw from the shutdown. But I think in the framing of that conversation, it forces us to rethink about how we analyze that data. And we encourage folks in that analysis, when the data allow, to take a step back and disaggregate by the characteristics believed to influence the vulnerability, which in many instances takes us circular. But if we do that, then we'll be able to identify vulnerable populations. So that was really quick, because I'm hoping, because this is new for us in terms of a framework, that I will get lots of questions to help us improve that. So what we're really asking folks is, if we could not center on the who, which I think excludes, and center on the vulnerability, whether or not we think about what we kind of think of as the privileged household as being economically vulnerable, depending on how that conversation is had, they may very well think of themselves as vulnerable. And what I hope comes out of that is the ability to shift and move policies differently, that it will alter the ways that many of your constituents and the organizations that are part of the consortium may think about partnering with other groups, because they've been centering on the group and not necessarily the vulnerability. But in centering on the vulnerability, you can rethink about who are your allies, who are the groups that you should be working with to actually pass policies. So I'm hoping that was helpful and informative.